Hello, my name is Shane Larango, and I love stories. Whether I write them, live them, perform them, listen to them, or talk about them, I was born for storytelling. Today, I would like to welcome Laura Packer. I first had the opportunity to meet Laura at a Texas storytelling conference and heard the most mesmerizing, amazing, silky story with Laura Packer twist, and it still just washes over me every single time that I think about it. I next got to meet her at a storytelling festival in South Carolina, and then in 2018, I think,
18,
she was
yep.
the headliner or a featured teller, let me get my words straight, at the Texas Storytelling Festival. And I got to hear more and more Laura Packer. She has degrees in storytelling or folklore and mythology, um, which is stories.
Mhm.
Um, she works with corporations on their story telling. She is at a grassroots level storytelling in the area where she lives and works. She travels the country with storytelling. She has a book and workbook called Audience to Zeal. She's won numerous awards, and I want to welcome, I love this too, the storyteller, coach, and real-time dreamer. Hello, Laura Packer.
Hi, Shane. I'm so happy to be here with you. This is great.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for coming on and being a part of it. And I was telling her too, is like at the very last question that I ask is the storyteller to tell me who I should ask for an interview next. And Peggy Helmick Richardson told me, you got to talk to Laura. And I was like, yes, I do. So, Laura, I'm going to jump right in. Tell me why you tell stories.
Whew, that's a good question, and it's one that I love, and I answer it differently every single time. But the thing that's consistent is that stories connect us. So when we tell a story, when we listen to a story, we cannot help but be connected with the other people who are involved, whether they're the listeners or the tellers. And it helps us feel connected to one another. It helps us learn about each other, helps us be kinder to each other. And it's a way to build, I think, to build a better, more connected, more compassionate world.
Mm.
Personally, I tell stories because I can't help it. It's just the words fall out of my mouth, whether or not I want them to. I grew up in an environment that really valued storytelling, and it has been one of the constants in my life since I was very, very small.
Yes. That's the same thing. I grew up telling family stories around the dinner table and, that kind of thing. It was just, that was what our family did. But how were you introduced then to storytelling as a professional art?
Oh, I love this story. Thank you for asking. So when I went to college, um, I wanted to get a degree in folklore and mythology, and which is in fact what I got my degree in. And for those of you who have been to college, or those of you who have ever been in your late teens and early 20s, that is the time in your life when you have these deep and important conversations. Some people continue having them, but most of us have them at that point in our lives. And I met this guy in college with whom I would stay up all night talking about philosophy. And he was really into Taoism. And I was really into the idea of magic and the kind of folklore, magical folklore that you find. And so we were talking a lot about it, and I loved the King Arthur stories. I told him about them. He said, "Have you seen this movie called Night Riders?" With a K, Night Riders. I had no idea what he was talking about. So this was long enough ago that we had to rent a VCR and the videotape. And we set it up in the basement of our dorm where there was a TV, and a bunch of us got together to watch it. And I have to tell you, it's not a very good film. But the guy who plays Merlin in this film was out of this world. He told the story of King Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot, and I was completely riveted. And then while we were watching it, or just after, another friend who was watching it with us said, "Hey, that guy who plays Merlin, he tells stories down in Harvard Square all the time." So I went to see him, and that is how I met Brother Blue, who was an amazing storyteller and a big influence in the storytelling world. And he was the first professional storyteller that I ever knew I was meeting. So I was 17 when I met him. When I was 19, I took a storytelling class that he was teaching. And when I was in my mid-20s, I found a storytelling open mic that he was running. And I went and told my first story. I was terrified. But by the time I was done, I knew that that's what I would be doing for the rest of my life.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I was
At
really lucky
at
to be
19
able to
to know
find
what
that
you're gonna be
so
doing
young.
for the rest of your life is
Yep,
awesome too.
yep.
Wow. So, um, what kind of storyteller are you now? Because you started with an open mic, and I assume, is that personal stories, or was that
No, it was
'cause
traditional stories. So this
traditional
was
stories?
long enough ago that personal storytelling wasn't very common. Most
Okay.
people told traditional narrative back then.
Mhm.
And so I started by telling some folk and fairy tales, but also a lot of original fiction. I was really interested in what stories I could make up. I've always
Yeah.
been interested in what I can make up.
Me too.
Um,
Yeah.
and then I started expanding. So I told traditional material, I told original fiction, I told personal stories, I told some historical stories, and now I still have a very broad repertoire. So I tell some traditional material because I still love folk tales and myths. I tell some personal stories because I think personal narrative is important and powerful. And frankly, with the way the storytelling market is right now, it's important to have some personal stories in your repertoire. Um, and I still tell a lot of original material, be that twisted fairy tales, so fairy tales that I've broken apart and put back together again, or like the Selkie story that you mentioned, or original fiction, or things like that. So I have a pretty broad repertoire. I tell mostly for older children and adults. I sometimes tell with little kids, which is an awful lot of fun when I do it, but there are a lot of people who are extraordinary with small children, and I have come to believe that I don't have to do everything. That if there are
Mm.
people who are great storytellers with little kids, and I'm a good storyteller with little kids, I'll let the people who are great at it do it. And when I
Yeah.
get to do it, it just gets to be fun. So mostly I tell stories for adult audiences.
Mhm.
I'm really interested in how stories give us permission, and in particular fiction, or retold traditional narrative, give us permission to explore some of the more difficult things that can happen in our lives without it being directly recounted. So there's
Mhm.
power in a personal story that says this horrible thing happened to me, but it may be difficult for the audience to remain present with if they have had something similar and horrible that happened to them. But if I tell a story that uses metaphor and symbolism to talk about those difficult things, it's a way for us all to identify with it more closely and feel more empathy and compassion around it without necessarily being triggered by it at the same time. So I
Yeah.
really like original fiction and metaphorical stories.
Yes.
That's probably a more complicated answer than you wanted.
No, I love it, and I was actually introduced to that concept, through, a woman you know, Danielle Balone,
Oh, I
and
love Danielle.
I do too, and she talked about new trad, which was new
Hmm.
tradition, where you make something, sound like an ancient myth or whatever, and I actually wrote a very personal story using that, and it
Hmm.
helped me be able to tell it. So,
Yep.
yeah, I love
I have a
that.
lot of new trad material in my repertoire, original new trad stories, and I was doing that 25 years ago when no one else was, and people didn't really know what to make of it.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad there are other people doing it now, and that other people have embraced the joy and power that lies in that kind of material.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, you mentioned Brother Blue, which I have actually heard you tell a couple of stories about him before.
Mhm.
And as your mentor, who who else are your mentors, or is
So
he just the?
Brother Blue is the big one. You know,
Mm-hmm,
he's the one to whom I will be eternally grateful. But there are other people to whom I will be eternally grateful too. Elizabeth Ellis
mm-hmm,
has been a mentor to me, and I am honored by her tutelage and her insight. Doug Lippman is someone who has been a mentor for me, in particular in how to be a good coach. He's really helped me understand develop a coaching philosophy that I think keeps the storyteller at the center of it. And the coach's job is to help that storyteller find their own way. Those are the three really big ones, but
Mm-hmm.
there are innumerable other people: Judith Black, Joe Radner, Danielle Ballone, from whom I've learned a great deal, even as I was mentoring her. I've learned stuff by watching you. Every storyteller I see, I learn something from. But the three big ones are Brother Blue and his wife, Ruth Hill, who has mentored and loved me and believed in me for a long time, Doug, and Elizabeth.
Wow,
I'm very fortunate. I'm very fortunate.
that's amazing. And you mentioned coaching. So what ways do you mentor others? Um, in
As a coach or just in
just
general?
in general, like,
Okay. So I never say no when someone asks me to mentor them, to help them. I may sometimes have to place some boundaries around it,
mm-hmm,
in terms of time and energy. However, the most important thing that I can offer anyone who comes to me for mentoring is believing in them. If they come to me saying, I want to do this, then my response is, great, I know you can. Let's figure out how you can do it in the way that is most authentic to who you are, which sometimes can mean that they decide that they don't want to be a performing storyteller after all. There's
mm-hmm,
someone I mentored for a while who ended up becoming a poetry instructor, because what they really loved was speaking poems and poetic language and storytelling. That's what drew them to me, that I can use some poetic language. But what they really loved was poetry, and that they wanted to share that love of poetry. So I mentored them through storytelling, but in the course of that, they realized that the guiding light for them was poetry. Uh,
yes.
I
It's
think my
very important to figure out what you don't want to do.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
And I think my job as a mentor is basically to say, wow, and then get out of the way.
Mm-hmm,
Or to say, wow, I really loved what you did. Do you want to try something? Have you thought about? I wonder if.
mm-hmm.
But to never say, well, that really sucked.
Yeah.
That's not mentoring. That's taking out my own frustration on them. It's my job as a mentor is to love someone into a place where they will be most themselves and be
Yes.
themselves as successfully as possible, whatever
Oh,
that means to them.
oh my gosh. Isn't that the philosophy of life, to love somebody till they can be themselves like that?
Mhm.
I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. Well, how do you continue to develop your craft of storytelling? What are some things that you do?
Um, I do a bunch of things. So I keep telling, and I keep trying to go to the places that are uncomfortable for me. I am a
Mm,
big fan of discomfort. And in fact, I do that with the people I mentor as well, with the people I coach, to encourage them to do some of the things that are uncomfortable, because it is when we are uncomfortable that we might actually learn something new and discover something new about ourselves. So I try and do what's uncomfortable. I keep telling. So since I don't know if I'm allowed to mention when this is that okay? All right.
yeah.
So because we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and many of us are staying home to try and stay safe and decrease incidence of the disease, as soon as it started or very shortly thereafter, I started doing Facebook Live storytelling sets. Initially 3 days a week. Now I'm doing it 2 days a week. But what that required of me were a bunch of things. It meant I had to get comfortable with being live and being recorded live. I had to get comfortable with it being a much more intimate, casual atmosphere. Right now, we're in my office, and I am
Right.
not dressed up in storytelling clothes. I put on a little lipstick, and that was the extent of it. You can see some of the chaos behind me. So it forced me to become comfortable with being that much more authentic with people, which I think is really the key to the best storytelling is profoundly authentic to who that person is.
Mm.
And it also forced me to learn a lot of folk tales. I have now done, I'm sorry about the noise outside. Is that bothering? Okay.
Mm-mm, I can't
Um,
hear it. Yeah.
for everyone listening to the podcast, I have my window open and I live on a really potholy street. So whenever something goes by, it clatters a lot. Um, so I've had to learn a lot of folk tales. So I made the decision when I started doing these Facebook Live sessions that I would tell traditional material, because my original material going out over a medium like Facebook Live, it would be very easy for someone to take that story and retell it as their own.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying to shake a finger or anything, but I don't want my stories to be taken. The
Right.
stories that I craft myself matter to me, and they are personal to me. So I decided to tell traditional material, which meant that I already had a pretty big repertoire of traditional stories. I didn't have enough to tell stories 3 times a week, 1 or 2 stories a session, and never repeat a story. And I
Mm-hmm.
set the condition for myself that I wanted to only rarely repeat stories. So another way I work on getting better is I learn new stuff and then I tell it. I tell stories as often as I can. So that's part 1. I tell. Part 2, which is at least as important, if not more so, is I listen. I try and listen to other storytellers, and I try to listen to storytellers who tell in ways that are radically different from mine.
Mm-hmm.
I never want to tell a story like J. O'Callahan does, but I can and do deeply admire the way he does it, and I learn something every time I see him or listen to him. Um, I could never and would never want to tell a story the way that, um, oh, her name was just in my head. Well, the way that Linda Goss does. But every time I listen to her, I learn something.
Mm-hmm.
So I listen to stories. And then the other way, so it's discomfort, being willing to be uncomfortable,
Yeah.
telling, listening. And then for me, a big part of how I keep myself sharp as a storyteller is I teach. So in order to teach something well, I have to have a deep understanding of it. So
Right.
I've continued teaching, and I teach regularly. 1, because I want to share what I know. I teach and write. But 2, because it makes me think more analytically and carefully about all of these different issues in storytelling, if I actually have to teach someone else how to do it or write about why it matters to me.
That's amazing. Well, I'm going to ask you a combo question. So,
Okay.
where do you find your traditional stories? Let's focus on that right now. Where do you find your traditional stories? How do you then discern that you want to tell that story or that story is right for you to tell? And then
Mhm.
how do you make it your own?
Those are great questions. I love that. So I'm not going to move my computer around because that would be dizzying for everyone watching, but I have a library of about 1,000 volumes of folktales and myths. So first, I go to my library, and I pull down a book I haven't read in a while. When there are 1,000 of them, there are a lot I haven't read in years. And then I flip through it and find something and read it. That's one resource. Another resource is, I would say, is the public library, but public libraries aren't really accessible right now.
Mm-hmm.
But there are innumerable online resources for
Mm-hmm.
traditional material. Chenga Zalka's blog, her multicolored diary blog, is a fantastic resource for traditional material. Karen Chase's Storybug blog is another great resource for traditional material, and Jackie Baldwin's blog as well. She passed away recently. May she rest in power. Um, so there are a bunch of storytellers resources, but then there are things like Google search, folktale about dogs. I'm just making that up. And you'll get innumerable responses. The National Storytelling Network also, if you're a member, gives you access to the Greenwood Library of Folklore and Folktale, which is
Mm-hmm.
a fantastic resource that's used by many universities. So I look at that and explore randomly. I'll put in a random search term. Um, there's also a website called Sur la Lune, which has all different kinds of fairy tales, annotated versions of fairy tales, which can then lead you to more obscure versions of those fairy tales. And those are just a few. I could spend a
Yeah.
long time talking about this, but there are all different kinds of ways that I find stories, traditional material. How do I determine what to tell? And if it's relevant, if it's a story I want to tell? That was the next part, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Um, so the first thing I have to admit is I have some limitations in what I'm willing to tell. I try not to tell stories from cultures that have been badly abused and stolen from by people who look like me. So I don't tend to tell Native American stories. I don't tend to tell many African American stories or many stories from the sub-Saharan African continent. There are a few I tell, but I make sure I research them thoroughly. I try not to tell stories that are part of a living sacred tradition if that story is one of the foundational stories of that tradition. So for example, although it's a Native American story, so I won't tell it anyway, How Raven Brings Light to the World is a living sacred story from a
Mm-hmm.
culture that has had an awful lot stolen from them. So why should I steal their stories? So there are some self-constraints that I have about what I will and will not tell, more than what I'm describing, but that gives you a sense for it. So within those constraints, I find a story that I think is kind of cool, and I read it, and honestly, a lot of it's gut feeling. I like this story. I want to share it. Some of the things that make a story more likely to be one of the ones that I will like is that it's not terrifically sexist. A lot of traditional material is remarkably sexist.
Yes.
Um, there's some sense of compassion in the stories. Compassion is one of my founding values. So I look for stories that have compassion in them. There's something that I think could be learned from this story because traditional material covers the entire range of human experience. So of course these stories are still relevant. So what is the lesson contained in this story? But honestly, mostly I go with my gut. Ooh, I love that story. I want to share that. Um, and then I go about learning it. So the way I learn a story is I read it, I write down a rough outline of it that I call the bones, so the very basic structure of it. And then I start practicing it. I tell it to myself while I go for walks, while I go for drives. And then I tell it to those who are dearest to me and who don't care if I mess up a story. And often I don't even tell it or I'll talk about the story. So I might say, so there's this Russian story called Maria Morevna. And these are the things that happen in it, rather than starting the story with once upon a time in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I practice it. And it is in the course of that practicing that the story becomes my own, because none of us can tell a story without it somehow becoming our own. There are things that I will emphasize more than other tellers might, because
Mm-hmm.
those are the things that matter to me more. So a lot of it is in recognizing that this is just going to happen. And so I give it permission to happen and don't try and limit myself from doing it because I've already made good ethical choices about what story I'm telling and why I tell it.
And so when you get I want to talk about like traditionally, like at festivals or in public, when
Mhm.
you do have an audience sitting before you, but also like now when like you don't know necessarily, maybe you might know who signed up or joined or whatever, but also that this is being recorded. So you have no idea
Mhm.
down the line about who's going to be the audience. How do you determine what stories that you're going to tell? Do you do a set
So,
list? Do you fill the audience out?
so I do both. I do
Mhm,
both. This doesn't apply to the Facebook Live storytelling
mhm,
because that is one or two stories. So I plan that ahead of time so I can track it, quite honestly.
okay.
Um, it helps if I have a rough idea of who the audience is going to be. So it's likely that people watching, excuse me, this recording are people who are interested in storytelling, people who like you, so therefore I'm already inclined to like them, or people who like me. It's not likely that someone is going to plop a 2-year-old down in front of this, unless it is an exceptionally linguistically gifted 2-year-old, which is possible. But it's so I start out by trying to get some sense of who the audience is.
Mhm.
I believe that storytelling is an act of service for the audience. Hold on. I'm
I'll
really
join you.
sorry,
I'll join you.
both Shane and other listeners. I have allergies. I'm not sick, but I have allergies, so I'm going to be sipping water and coughing now. Um, so storytelling is an act of service. It is not all about me. It is about all of us in the shared moment, even if it's a recorded moment. So I
Mm,
try and pick stories that I think will be of most service to the audience. What that means is that I have some kind of set list, usually if I'm going to be telling more than one or two stories, but I also have some gaps in that set list and some ideas about what I might fill in. Um, so what that means is I can watch the audience in a live experience
Mhm.
and see how they're responding and what they might need. Cough drop.
No,
Sorry.
yeah, no worries.
Um,
And I was going to say, if you ever want me to pause the recording, I'll pause it and then we can just pick back up.
no, I'm okay in the moment as long as all you listeners can forgive me for chewing a cough drop.
They can.
Okay. Um, so I do tend to have a rough set list,
Hmm.
but sometimes it's, all right, I want to tell one of these 3 stories. If I'm at a festival, for example, and I'm part of an oleo, I want to tell one of these few stories because I think the audience here will like that. And then I
Hmm.
pay attention to what the person before me told, and I decide what will be the best follow-on for that. Or if I'm first, I try and tell something that is really inviting and brings everyone into the moment, and something that leaves the teller following with a really good place to go. There are stories that just stink to follow. I tell some of those stories, and I have been in the situation of having to follow some of those stories. So I try not to do that to other people. Um, so so I try and pay attention. I have a big
Yeah.
repertoire, which helps.
Yeah.
My repertoire at this point is up to about somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 or 600 stories. And most of them I could retell with not very much prep. Some of them need some prep time, but there are always, 20 or 30 stories in my head that I could tell at a moment's notice, unless you ask me to, in which case I'll freeze.
Like,
Um,
whoa.
but but it's just the way my brain is wired. My brain is
Hmm.
wired for that. I'm really lucky. Um, so what I tell depends on the audience's needs, the context of the moment. So right now might not be a good time to tell stories about well, it depends if it's the wrong audience. Zombie stories, because of the disease that sweeps the world, might not be that great most of the time right now. There are
Hmm.
some audiences who might find that very comforting.
Mm.
So it's paying attention to the audience, paying attention to the context, and paying attention to what my own needs are in that moment, as well as doing some prep work,
Yeah.
because there's always a chance I won't be able to think of anything. So it's good to know that I have, all right, these 6 stories are ready to go.
And for people who are into storytelling or um, just getting started or something, you talked about different ways that you prep
Mhm.
and prepare and telling stories to yourself, writing out the bones. What other things do you do, and how would you then talk to people who may have reservations about public storytelling?
So for anyone listening to this who might be hesitant about telling your story, I will say this. First, we need your story. The world needs your stories because you have unique experience that no one else has had, and that shapes anything you tell, whether it's a personal narrative or a traditional story. And when we share our stories, that world becomes a little more connected, like I said at the outset. So we need them. I need them.
Hmm.
That's one. If you're hesitant about public speaking, then one, try telling that story to someone who loves you and will not judge you, who won't say a harsh word to you. That might be your friend or your beloved. It might be your teddy bear. It might be your dog. It might be the trees. I tell a lot of stories to trees, especially new ones, new stories. And then once you've done that to someone who isn't going to judge you or condemn you in any way and will just be so happy that you're trying, you might need coaching. You might need to hire a coach, someone like me or someone not like me, but someone who can help you practice in ways that make you feel more confident. And then try stepping out into that world in some way that feels relatively safe. Go to an open mic, or go to an online open mic, and so the first time you don't unmute your mic, you don't let anyone see your video. And then the second time you go, maybe you let people see your videos, they can see you watching, and you get used to the idea of being on screen. And then the third time, maybe try telling a story. Open mics are generally very supportive environments. And the worst that happens is you make a mistake. And I can guarantee you that everybody else listening has made a mistake at some point in their lives. So if you have the slightest inclination to try it, oh, I hope you do. I hope you do.
Yeah.
So I'm looking directly at the camera, so I'm looking at you. But now, Shane, I'm going to look back at you because I love seeing your smiling face. So I
Well, I
hope.
love that too because I'm such an advocate for stories. Like I believe that every single one of us have voices that have something so valuable to say, and that it's imperative though that as the world we become good listeners.
Mhm.
Like so yeah, and just yeah, so I'm an advocate for
Yeah,
story as well.
yeah. On a
So
more practical basis, when you go listen to other people tell stories, if you're
mhm,
thinking about doing this, notice what you like, notice what you don't like. Try and imitate what you like. You know,
right.
try and just pay attention to what you think works. And once you know what works for other people, that'll help you figure out what works for you.
It's amazing. So, are you, and I'm going to skip around just a little bit, but are you part of any storytelling circles or guilds or associations that meet in person kind of thing for
Well,
to
we don't
help
meet in
us?
person right now.
Yeah, well, I know, but I meant like
Yep.
traditionally.
Sure.
Does
Yes. So
that help? And then what other benefits are part of those organizations?
I've had a number of storytelling communities. So my first storytelling community was the open mic that Brother Blue ran, that I went
Hmm.
to when I was in my early 20s and found out what I was going to be doing. Um, that series is still ongoing in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that was my first community of storytellers. I then discovered the National Storytelling Community, which includes the National Storytelling Network and its conference, and organizations like the Texas Storytelling Association. Um, I now am on I've been on the board of the National Storytelling Network and the New England Storytelling Community organization. And I'm now on the board of Story Arts Minnesota. And so that's the regional organization where I am now. And I think it's really important for those of us who can to offer that kind of service. So that's why I do it, because I want to serve my community and build a more supportive community. I also am a part of a group that meets every Wednesday. We did it in person and now we're doing it virtually, although honestly, I haven't been able to meet often virtually, to swap stories.
Mm,
And the intention of that group, it's peer coaching. So we share stories, and if someone wants feedback, they can get it. And if someone doesn't want feedback, they won't get it. And it's very supportive.
I
Um,
love that.
so I think peer coaching is really helpful. So if you want to become a better storyteller, get together with a couple of friends and just sit around and share stories. The ground rule needs to be that it's supportive and no one gets criticized harshly and no one gets even asked questions if they don't want it. That the
Mm,
first rule is that you're there to help each other build up, not get torn down. So
absolutely.
why do I think it's important? Because we humans are communal animals. We need each other. So when we work together in community, we can't help but be better, both at what we do and at supporting others. So I think it's vitally important.
Yeah. What is a memory that you have of the Texas Storytelling Festival?
Mm. So I have a bunch of memories of the Texas Storytelling Festival. Um, in 2018, when I was one of the featured tellers, I have this lovely, crisp memory of first walking into the building where it's held. I don't
Mm,
remember what the building's called, but it's like an arena,
hmm.
um,
The Denton Civic Center.
the Civic Center, and thinking what an incredible space it was because we were all there together. That sense of being together,
Hmm.
which is the other thing that I remember most about the whole Texas storytelling community that I've experienced is how incredibly welcoming everyone is, and how I just every time I have felt embraced and supported and loved up one side and down the other. I have felt welcomed in some really powerful ways. A really specific memory would be hanging out in the back of the Denton Civic Center, um, watching Tim Tingle on the stage, and watching how comfortable he was on the stage. And more than that, watching everyone in the audience just kind of lean back into his story, and how this was so clearly an experienced group of listeners who were really happy to be there.
Mm,
Um, so that's one of those shimmering memories, just that how everything in that moment was exactly the way it should be. watching all the listeners. I like staying at the back when I'm not performing because I like watching the audience. And it was a good audience to watch. And watching Paul Porter wandering around taking pictures,
Yes.
and how watching how he watched everything helped me be a better listener. That was a really good one too.
Oh, that's amazing. That's the behind the scenes. I love the
Mhm.
behind the scenes stories.
Mhm.
So, what story in your repertoire do you look forward to having the opportunity to tell time and time again?
Oh my goodness. That's a good question. Hang on, I need to crunch my cough drop, so I'm going to mute myself for a second.
Okay,
I know this is recorded. I hope you're okay with that.
I am completely fine.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you, everybody else listening. I just needed to get that out of my mouth.
When you muted your microphone, I realized that people could hear me drinking my tea. It's like I should have muted mine too.
That's okay. So, what story in my well, I look forward to telling most of them. I will share 3 favorites with you. One
Okay.
of them is a story that owes its birth to a story swap that Elizabeth Ellis hosted at the Bellingham, Washington Storytelling Conference. And the theme of the swap was stories you won't tell your mother. And it
I
was
love
a
it.
story that I'm not going to recount in detail here because of some of the language that it uses, but it
Hmm.
was a story about when I was 5 years old and encountered sexism for the first time and was told I couldn't do things because I was a girl, and the creative solution that I came up with to fix that problem. Um, so I love telling that story because when I do, um, assuming I've made the right judgment call with the audience, that's important with this one. Um, People laugh until they can't breathe, and in
Hmm.
particular, women laugh until they can't breathe. So I love telling that story. You were going to say something.
Yes, I was gonna say, so Peggy, that's when she first heard you. That was the first story that she heard you tell, and that's what her response was, and she was like, "You've gotta talk to Laura Packer." Like, it was that story, and I will say that I have had the fortune of also hearing that story, so I know exactly which one you're talking about.
I love telling it because of people's reactions. It's just
Mhm,
so much fun because they know where I'm going. They can figure it out
mhm.
pretty early on. But then when I actually get to the point where I'm using the words that I'm not going to use right now, none of which are obscene,
None of which,
they're all
and you
correct.
can use them. Please feel
Okay.
free to use
Um,
the word penis.
Penis. So I was 5 and I made a penis out of paper and I taped it on because if people didn't want me to do things because I was a girl, I knew the difference between girls and boys.
Mhm.
Um, but it is just so much fun watching people with that one. So I always look forward to telling that. I look forward to sharing any of the stories about the adventures of Crazy Jane and Red Haired Annie.
Oh,
So
love,
those,
yes.
yeah. So those are original fiction that are urban fantasy, magical realism, fabulous, however you might want to categorize it, about Crazy Jane, who's a holy fool, and her friend, Red Haired Annie, who is the more grounded one. And they have these ongoing adventures in a place that isn't quite once upon a time and it isn't quite here, but there's a lot of overlap. There
Yes.
are 14 of those stories. And I don't get to tell many of them very often, but I love telling them because they are from the middle of me. They are a deep part of who I am. So I love telling those stories.
And I will
Um,
say, just tell you that I will buy the book, I will buy the CD, I will watch the movie. I will love to see the video of you telling those stories. Like, I love Crazy Jane and Redhead Annie.
Thank you. I do too. I really love them. Um, and then there are, so what I'm trying to answer this with a range of stories as well. So I can't say there's one traditional story that I love telling above all others. There are many that I love. But I also do a lot of, I'm interested in how stories, as I said earlier, can help us talk about really difficult things. So one of my original stories, a piece of new trad storytelling, is a story called Blood Woman. That was a story that took years for me to figure out. And it started as this image of getting scraped and the blood beating up from the scrape and then
Mm,
it falling away from the arm and turning into rubies. and the sound like bells. Um, so it's a fairly long story, so I often don't have places where I can tell it. And it is one of the more violent stories that I tell because it is in part about abuse,
Mm.
several different kinds of abuse. And it's metaphorical around lots of different kinds of abuse. I love telling that story because she is a really intense character to inhabit. And there are people who desperately need to hear it um, because of their own experiences and what they may or may not have admitted is happening to them or has happened to them. And because it's one of those stories that just comes out of me in this rolling sea of power. It's a very powerful story to tell. And telling dark stories has something really important. It's really important. So those are three examples of some of the stories I love to tell.
And
I
now I
look forward to
can't
telling.
wait to have an opportunity to hear Blood Woman.
It may be one of the stories that I tell in my next online performance. I'm not sure yet. It's likely to be one. So you can find I can August 2nd at 2
Okay.
p.m. Central. You can find out about that at laurapacker.com/Zoom. It's a
Okay.
show of fairy tales for grown-ups.
Okay. All right. Yes. Because I'm very intrigued. I'm very intrigued. Um, so what stories do you see coming out of this time, this lockdown, this pandemic, the social change, the
Mhm.
voices that are being heard, the marching in the streets in the US and all over the world?
All over the
Like what
world.
stories do you see coming out of this? And how are we going to adapt to tell them during this time?
I think part of it is for people who look like you and me to listen more.
Mm,
Um, I think part of what I really hope people are learning out of the justifiable social unrest that we're seeing is that there are a lot of people who have not been heard for a very long time. And part of my job, part of my responsibility right now is to listen to those voices more and to do what I can to enhance those voices. Um, I think that's really important. Um, on a personal level, a lot of my story coming out of this will probably be about the choices that I am making or the choices I'm not making, as in not choosing, as in not avoiding making the choice,
mm,
but the choices that I'm making that surprise me about myself. I have been politically active my entire life, pretty much. I attended my first rally when I was 12. Um, and anybody watching this who doesn't know me, if you were to go to my personal Facebook page, you would know this in blinding detail really quickly. If you go to my professional stuff, I try and be a little more professional on professional sites. But when the Black Lives Matter rallies were happening really forcefully here in Minneapolis, um, I really wanted to go. And I chose not to
mm.
because I'm in my 50s, because I have some pre-existing conditions, and because I needed to minimize my risk of getting COVID. Um, that will end up being a story because realizing that I'm not who I was and that the choices I make are different now was and continues to be something really difficult. So there will be some personal narrative that comes out about this,
Mhm.
about what does it mean to, what are the different ways that we can fight for what we believe in, and how does that change as we age, and what does that mean about who we are. So for me, all of that is really lively right now. I think there are traditional stories that are coming out that I'm discovering while I'm doing all of this online storytelling during lockdown that I think have greater relevance now than I thought they
Mm.
did before. Stories about compassion, stories about greed, stories about how do we connect or not connect with others. Um, and for me, a big part of what I'm learning about this, I don't know that there's a story in this yet, but this has actually been one of the most important things that I've learned and continue to learn throughout this, is just how powerful stories are. That the intimacy of storytelling, the urgency and the immediacy of it does not go away when we are working through some form of mediated communication. In fact, there are ways in which if I give myself permission to, it becomes even more immediate, because when I tell stories, and I may not be able to see the audience, but I look at the camera, every person in that audience, I'm looking at you individually, which I can't do from a big stage. So all of this teaches me how, not teaches me, but reminds me of how very important storytelling is, and how it still can connect us even if we are physically distant. And that has been a profoundly important message for me.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Laura, is there any question that you want to answer about yourself or tell us about yourself or storytelling or your stories or anything? I call this the 9 planets question. And
Yeah.
one day I'll explain why it's the 9 planets question. But anything that we haven't touched on that you want to share?
Well, first off, I appreciate that it's still 9 planets, because Pluto deserves to be a planet.
Yes,
Yeah.
I even forgot about that. It's always going to be the 9 planets
Yeah.
question.
So what else do I want people to know? The marketing part of me wants me to let you all know that I am available for coaching, which I do via Zoom or Facebook or whatever tool you have over the phone, if you prefer. I'm available for performances. I am available for classes. I've actually been doing a lot of online teaching, and I'm really enjoying it. And I hope that, and I look forward to doing more of it, including things like small group coaching, where you and 4 to 5 other friends get together, you have me for a couple hours, and you get to learn from each other and from me while you get help with specific stories. My marketing brain also says I need to tell you that my book, From
Yes.
Audience to Zeal, The ABCs of Finding, Crafting, and Telling a Great Story, which was a 2020 Storytelling World Award winner, is available for purchase. And it has an accompanying workbook. And when you use them together, it is many, many, many hours of masterclass in storytelling. I also have a little deck of cards available as story prompts. So my
Yes.
marketing brain needs me to tell you all of that.
Please, I'm glad your marketing brain kicked in.
Yeah.
This
And
is
that I
what
would,
this is about. Like,
yeah,
we
and
have
that
to
I would
support
love,
storytellers.
we do, we do, and that I would love to work with as many of you as want to work with me. Which actually leads to the other part, which is not quite marketing, which is support the arts. That you are doing this, Shane, is a huge support for the arts, and that arts are vital, not just storytelling, but that humans are art. We are meaning-making creatures, and a big part of how we create meaning is through both the creation of and the consumption of arts. So even now, in these odd, frightening, disconnected times, support the arts, both yours and other people's, and don't be afraid to explore.
Yeah.
And then the last thing that I would want to say is that your stories matter and your art matters, whoever you are. Do you know that wonderful poem by Mary Oliver, Wild Geese?
I think I've read it before.
All right, so I'm going to pause for a sec so I can look it up, because I think that's actually where I want to end with
Okay.
that poem, because that poem says everything that I might want to say, only says it better.
Well, while you're looking for it, I want to tell that one of the reasons that I started this was because I felt so disconnected from being able to go and listen and learn from storytelling, because I'm pretty new to it as in the format that y'all know. I grew up telling stories, but that's a very different animal than getting on stage and telling it in front of people that you don't know. So this has been invaluable, just that I just got started, and I'm just mesmerized and just overwhelmed by how awesome it is so far. So I'm glad that it also supports y'all. But this is so valuable for me. And even through this time, you talk about supporting the arts, I have like an idea to recraft the story that Ant and the Grasshopper.
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a
Hmm.
great one for now.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't tell traditional stories yet, so I'm
Mhm.
learning about that. So I'm working on that to kind of make it my own.
Well, if you want
How
to
the
play with me,
grasshopper had
I'd love to help you with that.
Okay, yeah.
If you need help, I'd be happy to listen.
Okay. Well, I
Yeah.
just had this idea today about recently, about how the grasshopper had so much value that's not I've never heard in that particular story. So,
Hmm. Yep.
yeah.
I've heard a telling of that where, do you want to hear about this, or do you
Oh,
want to? Okay.
absolutely. Sure.
Where the grasshopper's music helps the ant work better.
Yes, that's what. See, it's
And
already been done.
yep. Well, no, but you can go to it too. There's
Yeah.
also a Mexican story about an ant who is a really hard worker, but yearns to be something more. And one day he finds a flute. And so when he's not working, he practices the flute. And eventually, this is a traditional Mexican story, eventually he leaves the ant hill in the hopes that he can play the flute at weddings and make a living. And he wanders around playing the flute at weddings and finally finds his way to another ant hill. And his music is so beautiful that the ants there say, "We'd best introduce you to our queen." So he plays music for the queen, and she loves the music. And so he plays, and everyone works better and everyone is happier. And some of the ants decide to start playing their own music. And then they get word that an invading army is coming. An invading army of ants, because it's the biggest anthill anyone has ever seen. And the queen, rather than having her entire populace be killed by this enormous invading army, is about to say to them, "All of you should run, and I will stay here, and they can have me, but you at least will be safe." And the flute player says, "Wait, I think I have something I can do." So he tells them his plan, and what he does is he sneaks out to a place a little ways away from the anthill, and as the invading army comes in, he starts playing his flute. And the invading ants can't help but start dancing because the music is so great and so enchanting. But the ants in the other anthill, the one where he's been living, have become accustomed to his music, and although they still love it, they're not enchanted by it, so they're able to rout the invading army. And so he stays in that anthill, and everyone gets to enjoy his music, and he and the queen live happily ever after. Isn't that a great one? I love that story.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So I found that in the Greenwood database of stories. I
Mhm.
was looking for stories about ants.
Mhm.
Um, I'd been gardening, and my local ants decided they didn't like that what I was doing, so they started biting me. And then it was time for me to do my Facebook stories, so I wanted to tell stories about ants, and that was one of the ones I found. And I just love that story.
I do too. And I love that how you routed to that story. I mean, that's great that
Good.
gardening led you to tell this, yeah, to find this. It's
They were just
beautiful.
trying to keep their house safe, so
Yeah.
I probably deserved a few bites. So you asked what I wanted to leave everybody with.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have a final question,
Oh,
which is about where I'm going next. So do you want me to ask that question and then you
no,
leave
let
us
me
with
share
this?
this poem with you
Okay.
and then ask your last question.
Okay.
So the reason I want to share this poem with you is I think it's something important for us all to remember right now, and
Hmm.
to remember that even though we may be physically separate, we're still part of something greater than ourselves, and that our individual voice still matters. Um, and that listening, I mean, this doesn't say this directly, but that listening to each other and caring for each other is what will get us through. Being kind.
Yes.
Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and clear pebbles of rain are moving across the landscape, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
I realized that I've been using the word mesmerizing a lot during this past hour. And the reason is, Laura, you are mesmerizing, like so mesmerizing. So thank you so much. I want to ask you, what storyteller do you think that I should ask to interview next? And maybe why?
Can I give you two?
Absolutely.
So I'm giving you two for two very different reasons. One is Rachel Ann Harding. So
Yes.
Rachel Ann is a storyteller based in Colorado. She is a traditional tale teller, but she has a deep and growing understanding of those stories and of why they matter.
Mm.
Um, I love Rachel Ann's storytelling, and I think she's someone to watch. So I would love to see you interview her. The other person I was thinking of is Brother John, who is a storyteller who lives in the Kansas City area, Kansas City, Missouri. Brother John does kind of historical recreations, often of musicians, and shares their stories of Black musicians throughout the 20th century. And his story is very much about the fight for civil rights and about being who you most fully are, but it's also intertwined with music and with his own story. And I think Brother John is a remarkable man. I love his work, and I would love to see him find a bigger audience. Um, and as I said, I think part of our job right now for people like you and me is to listen better to people of color. And I
Absolutely.
think Brother John should be listened to. So I hope that you pick him too.
I do. I will pick both of them. And actually, Rachel Ann Harding is on my list too, because we
Excellent.
all hung out.
Yep.
And oh my gosh, yes, meeting her and listening to her Story podcast. Yes, and I look forward to meeting Brother John if he'll do an interview with me. So
If
I
you
think
need an
Rachel will.
introduction, I'd be happy to do that
Yes,
for you.
yeah, I want that so
Yeah.
much. Well, Laura, I cannot express to you how important this has been to me and what valuable information that you have shared. Just, yeah, I'm going to go back and watch this and pause it and take out notes. It was so incredible. And I also want to kind of wrap this up, and yeah, hold on, let me take a deep breath. I'm such a fangirl. Such a
Mutual,
fangirl.
Shane. Mutual.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So thank you, Laura Packer.
Thank you, Shane. I'm so happy to be here.
Yes. And thank you, audience, that if you're watching, this is Shane Larango, and these are my Storyteller stories. Thank you for listening. Wait.
It won't let you stop?
No, I was pushing the wrong button. Stop recording.